My name is David Stark. I'm talking this afternoon with Jonathan Bach, who is a professor of international studies at the New School. Thanks very much, Jonathan. The article that you have in our special issue of the British Journal of Sociology is on the Chinese social credit system. Some people may have heard about it, but not everybody knows. What is the Chinese social credit system?
Well, in brief, it's the use of big data in order to ensure that citizens comply with laws and regulations and other kinds of directives. But in essence, it's a reaction to three very large problems in contemporary China. One of them has to do with the fact that there's not enough of a credit record for many people in order to be able to extend credit. The other is, a second one is that there's a question of being able to control the population movements and wanting to have a better sense of who is where and who's doing what. And the third is there are very large problems with corruption and all kinds of non-compliance. And so the social credit system is designed in order to increase the general level of trust across the population by taking a lot of the determination of trust out of the hands of individuals and into algorithms and big data.
So what kind of information goes into compiling one's social credit system? I know, like in the United States, we all have credit scores. Those are done by banks and lenders and stuff like that. How's the social credit system in China different from that?
So it's very similar in the sense that all of the kind of information that you would have in the United States or Western Europe would also be part of the score. For example, whether you're behind on loan payments or car payments or something like that. At the same time, it seems to aggregate a lot of data about your consumer behavior, which is also possible in the United States and other places in the world. And in addition to that, there are experiments with different kinds of behavior that can either increase or decrease your score, including, for example, altruistic behavior. Do you visit your parents, your elderly parents? Do you contribute to charities? Anything that can be a proxy for what could be considered being trustworthy or untrustworthy becomes a possible data point. And one of the main differences between this system and the credit scoring in the United States and Europe is that if you have a low score or if you are found to be not in compliance with certain regulations, you may be placed on a blacklist. And that blacklist will have a form of a punishment, which most notably will restrict people's travel, but can also restrict all kinds of other activities. There's also a red list, which gives you points that makes things easier. So for example, you could get loans at a lower interest rate, or you can avoid having to pay a deposit on an apartment. And so this system of incentives, the so-called blacklist and red list, takes the credit scoring that we have in the United States and Europe a whole step further by making what is only known to the credit agencies here ostensibly known to all parties, not the algorithm that determines it, but what your essential score is.
Does this Chinese social credit system already exist? Is it like countrywide?
That's a very good question. So at this point, there are many pilots of the social credit system being rolled out all across the country. So even though there is a national ID number to which some of the data is tied, it is a case that a lot of what people think of as social credit score is actually local rather than national. In other words, the municipal government can have certain kinds of criteria and certain kinds of blacklists or red lists, which would only apply in a given city and not necessarily in another city. This is parallel to some of the national components of it. For example, if you are out of compliance with a national law or you've defaulted on a loan, that would be reported nationally. But if you didn't clean up after your dog in particular cities, that would likely not be recorded nationally, but only be recorded locally. However, it's unclear how the different scores might affect each other. In other words, if you have a bad score in one city, that data is theoretically accessible outside of the city, but nobody knows exactly for sure how it feeds into the bigger picture.
So there's different systems in different cities and provinces that are somehow linked to each other, or are they not yet linked to each other?
Well, they're partially linked to each other. One of the reasons why it's so diverse is, well, there are two reasons why it's so diverse. One of them has to do with a policy initiative, which is a time-honored policy approach within China, which is to allow different areas to experiment in order to have various tests ongoing and therefore figure out what works and what doesn't work, and also be able to shut down problems without affecting the entire system. So one reason why there are divergences in the system is because the central government is purposely wanting there to be experimentation. So that's one. The second is, as part of that, a lot of the software is being developed by private companies and in tandem with private companies, as well as by municipal governments, sometimes subcontracting with private companies. So you are having a mixture at different levels, because sometimes a private company like Tencent or Alibaba is national, but sometimes an app developed for Shanghai or Hangzhou will be developed by a local company only for use in that city.
So it's national government, regional government, provincial governments, local governments, and private companies as well. So lots of different entities are involved in creating and maintaining, organizing the system. Do I got it right?
That's right, which is both a strength and a weakness of the system, because you have so many different actors. At the national level, you have many different actors from different ministries to different regulatory agencies to banks. At the municipal and at the local level and at the private sector level also, you have a very, very large number of actors. This is a weakness in the sense that it is harder to tell what's working and what's not working, but it's also a strength because when things end up working, they've really been tried out.
If I understand it, it results for any given person in a single number.
Not yet. That's the holy grail. First of all, there are scores for individuals, and then there are scores for companies. So that's one distinction. A corporate entity has its own score, whether it complies with regulations, meets standards, etc. Individuals are held to account whether they also comply with regulations, but also engage in the correct behavior. Right now, there is a national score for certain kinds of activities, such as compliance with certain laws. However, the local level scores are independent of that. So you can receive a rating from your local city, which is not a national rating. And some of these are authorized, some of these are not authorized by the national government. And in fact, local businesses or entities have been encouraged to develop their own forms of scoring. And what this effectively is doing is creating a kind of, maybe you could call it a total scoring environment, where scoring becomes the way in which entities develop forms of accountability and ways in which people are incentivized or punished for deviating from the norm or being part of the norm.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of a proliferation of scoring such that even a local village can set up its own scoring rubric as long as they have the kind of software that would allow them to do it. And what also is interesting is that companies can have their version of scoring for providing, like I said, incentives and disincentives. Most companies are more interested in incentives. Governments are more interested in disincentives. So companies will want you to raise your score in order to be able to access perks, such as being able to use a bike share program without paying a deposit. Governments are more interested in the disincentive, such as punishing you by prohibiting you from staying in a luxury hotel or traveling in a high-speed train unless you pay your fine on time.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
So it's really, it's not right to speak of a single score. It's really better to speak of a scoring culture.